Malls are supposed to be places of light, laughter, and endless distraction. A maze of neon signs, food courts humming with chatter, and stores spilling out music meant to keep you wandering for hours. But what happens when all of that fades away? When the crowds vanish, the escalators grind to a halt, and the only sounds left are the hollow echoes of your own footsteps bouncing through deserted halls. At night, a mall becomes something different, an empty shell that feels too big, too quiet, and far too alive for comfort. Shadows linger a little too long, reflections in the glass shift when no one moves, and every creak of the building feels like it's holding its breath. Tonight's story follows Michael, a security guard who thought his shift would be routine. But as the hours dragged on, he realized he wasn't the only one walking those polished floors. Because when the lights dim and silence takes over, the mall itself seems to have an agenda, and Michael is about to find out what happens when you're trapped in its grip. There are jobs that ask very little of you and give back even less. Security on the night shift is one of them. A pattern of steps repeated until the body learns them by habit, the small exchange of light and shadow as you move through spaces that are meant to be full of people but are, for long hours, entirely without them. That was Michael's work. The building was his assignment, the hours his currency. If nothing went wrong, the night would be a quiet, measured victory. He learned the mall in sections. The East Concourse with its glass storefronts, the food court that smelled faintly of oil no matter how many times the fryers were switched off, the West Wing where several stores had drawn the paper down over their windows and retreated into vacancy. He knew where the lights hummed steady and where the fixtures were temperamental. He knew which emergency exit squealed when it was barely ajar and which stairwell swallowed echoes whole. Routine was his companion. Routine made the hours tolerable. On paper the job was simple. Do the rounds, check the doors, log anything unusual. Practical rules reduced risk to habit. Michael carried a small logbook in the inner pocket of his jacket and a pen that had survived more shifts than he cared to count. Every hour he tapped the radio and read his position. Once an hour. Twice if a storm came through or the power dipped. The checks were formalities that tethered him to a place that was otherwise prone to losing its shape once the crowds left. The first weeks were mostly uneventful. Empty shifts folded into one another. A lamp that needed replacing here, a locked storage door there. He learned to like the way the building felt like a machine you could understand if you walked through it enough. At night the mall turned inward. Posters that during the day lured customers became pale rectangles of paper. Mannequins, carefully posed at noon, seemed to lean toward the nearest light at 2 in the morning and then hold that pose like frozen actors. That pause between the daytime noise and the night's deeper quiet carried a particular exposure. Without conversations to hide behind, without the clutter of people, every small sound took shape. The vents sighed. Pipes adjusted. Elevators shivered through their shafts like distant heartbeats. Each noise, when left alone in a vast interior, could begin to feel like intention. Michael marked anomalies in the log with brief, efficient notes. A gate rattled at 1:13. Found a misplaced broom in the janitor's closet at 2:06. Camera 12 captured a flicker at 2:48. He did not dwell on the entries. Doing so would have been indulgent. Security work required a kind of blunt practicality. Record, respond if necessary, move on. Yet patterns will form if you watch long enough. Small incidents began to cluster in certain parts of the building. Service corridors, the stairwell by the old theater, the far end of the West Wing where vacancies had left odd, cavernous spaces. Those areas had qualities the rest of the mall did not. The lighting was thinner, service doors hissed with trapped air, the acoustics extended a footstep into a fold of time. When the cameras alerted him, the movement was usually vague. A smear across grainy monochrome or a shadow too quick to fix into a human shape. Rational explanations were always available. Old wiring. Sensor sensitivity. Maintenance teams that pried open gullies of creaks. He leaned on those explanations as if they were shields. Still, the sensation grew. The rooms on the monitors looked too full of absence. Instead of space opening up when he looked, it felt like the building kept something tucked under its ribs, something that only showed itself in the half-seen moments between one patrol and the next. He would tell you he was tired, and maybe he was. Long nights have their own slow erosion. But tiredness does not produce the specific sharpness of attention that a repeated anomaly demands. Tiredness makes you sloppy. Anomalies make you attentive. Michael was attentive. He had to be. One night, while walking the North Concourse, he passed the boarded-up department store that had been closed since the chain folded. The paper over the windows was old and crisp. Advertising overlays faded into a soft gray. He remembered that it had once been busy, filled with mannequins arranged in canned scenes and aisles of seasonal displays. Now it seemed to breathe with a different rhythm. As he swept his flashlight across the papered glass, the light caught a subtle movement behind it, as if something had shifted position relative to the paper. He stopped and waited. The shine of his flashlight slid over the paper and met only a dull surface. No door opened. No shadow crossed the floor. The movement he had seen resolved like a trick of angle. He wrote in his log, "Check departmental window, no entry. Time, 1:59. His handwriting was tidy, but his hand moved slightly faster than usual. He walked on. The photo booth in the food court had once been a novelty for teenagers. Now the curtain hung like a small, dark mouth that sometimes quivered even when the booth was empty. Michael found himself pausing there with a ridiculous sort of expectation, as if some small human mischief might announce itself in the soft movement of fabric. At 2:15, the curtain drifted inward as if a draft had nudged it. He placed a hand on the metal frame and the curtain stilled. Wind, he told himself, but the mall is not a wind-swept structure. It is a controlled environment. He knew that, yet the curtain's motion lodged in his mind like a seed. Another time, a convex mirror in a service corridor betrayed a reflection he hadn't expected. From a distance, the mirror showed him approaching, a small, dark figure in a bright corridor. Behind that reflection, further than the corridor should have allowed, something moved and then froze. He walked down the corridor at a measured pace, expecting to find a maintenance cart or a stray employee. The corridor was empty. The mirror's faint extra distance was an optical quirk, a small trick his rational mind could name, but it burned a line of unease that did not go away when he tried to outrun it. On other nights, the public address system would cough to life. It was supposed to carry announcements and seasonal sales promos. Instead, it offered up static and the ghost of syllables that lacked context. Once the speakers filled with a barely formed murmur, a fragment of language cut mid-word, that made the underside of the atrium seem to tilt. He found himself listening too hard, searching for a meaning in noise where none may have existed. Log after log began to hold a string of small interruptions clustered tighter than coincidence should allow. A loose bolt found on an emergency exit at 3:05. A brief power dip in a junction that the maintenance report later called a transient fault. On camera 11, a smear across the frame at 3:22 that disappeared when he panned the lens. Every time he wrote the entry, the pen pressed darker, as if the ink attempted to anchor an explanation to the page. He started to develop rituals. He checked the maintenance room twice when he passed, not because the equipment had indicated a fault, but because, in the way of men who work alone, rituals feel like defense. He would stop at the atrium railing and hold his light steady on the center fountain until his eyes adjusted. He learned to watch the handrails on escalators, the silicone flares near emergency lighting, the corners where service doors sealed against their frames. It was tedious. It was also the only thing that kept him moving forward without panicking. Once, as he made the rounds near the loading docks, he found an indentation in dust along the concrete, a faint line like a footprint that suggested a weight had been dragged rather than walked. He crouched and traced it with one gloved finger. The dust took the shape expected and then held it. No stray object lay nearby. The mark led toward the service door and stopped as if someone had vanished into the wall. He stood up, checking the perimeter twice. Doors were locked. The camera showed only tiles. He noted the entry, 3:48, dust mark at dock door, no visible cause. The handwriting trembled this time. These were not the events of a single dramatic night. There were no loud, cinematic shocks. There were instead dozens of small anomalies strung together in a sequence that taught a man how to doubt the thin veneer of what he thought was safe. Something about those nights taught Michael to mistrust certainty. He began to watch not only the building but the space between his expectations and the world as it presented itself. The longer he stayed, the more the building seemed to rearrange itself into a series of half-seen alignments. Where he expected tiles, he found shadows that held their position just a moment too long. Where he expected dead air, he found a tremor of sound that rose like a question and fell before the ear could answer. Mornings did not feel like relief, they felt like a temporary reprieve. He would leave as he always did, and the sun would make the place ordinary again. But day by day his nerves packed smaller and smaller notches against the next night. At the end of one shift, as gray edged the windows and the first commuter cars arrived in the lot, Michael glanced back through the security office glass and caught a movement that did not belong to the morning bustle. Behind him, in the reflection, a figure lingered a pace behind his shoulder, as if leaning into the reflection itself. He spun. There was no one there. The lot, which earlier had looked benign and full of commuters, seemed suddenly to contain a space where nothing should be. He walked away with the sensation of an unannounced presence trailing the line of his steps. It was the kind of impression that leaves no physical record but imprints itself on decisions. He found he could not quite laugh it off. He found that he looked again at the logs he had written, at the thin lines of ink that insisted he had seen and recorded oddities, and wondered how long it would take for those small wrongnesses to accumulate into something that could no longer be explained away. He did not know then what shape that accumulation would take. All he knew was that the map of his nights had changed. The space he had once moved through by habit had acquired edges he could not smooth with routine. And the more time he spent in those corridors, the clearer it became that the mall at night was not simply empty, it was waiting. Michael adjusted the straps of his vest as he re-entered the corridor, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark like a fragile thread. The silence pressed closer now, heavier than before, as though the mall itself had registered his earlier hesitation and was answering in kind. His boots struck the tile floor with hollow echoes that traveled farther than they should have, rebounding from corners and doorways like faint replies he hadn't asked for. He tried to ground himself in routine, flipping his notepad open once more. 2:37 a.m., he muttered, his pen scratching against paper. Checked the east corridor, nothing unusual. The words felt empty, a forced declaration meant to overwrite the sensations gathering just beneath his skin. But when he looked at the line he had written, he noticed his hand was trembling, the ink jerking across the page in an unsteady wave. As he turned into the wide atrium, the mall revealed its vast hollow chest. The glass skylight stretched above like the lid of an aquarium, trapping the moonlight inside. The fountains that once cascaded water in soft arcs now sat dry and silent, the stone bowls cracked and etched with mineral stains. The shop fronts looked like faces with shuttered eyes, their promotional posters peeling in layers, smiling models frozen mid-gesture, advertisements for sales long past. He swept his flashlight across them, and for a moment he thought he saw one of the glossy posters ripple, like someone standing just behind it had shifted. He froze, the light pinning the poster, but it was still just paper, just ink. Michael's grip tightened on the flashlight. He considered radioing his supervisor but imagined the inevitable laughter. He had been warned once already about jumping at shadows. The mall management wanted no distractions, no talk of unsettling atmospheres that might discourage potential tenants. So he pressed forward, past the hollow fountain, past the shut-down food court where tables sat overturned like bones of forgotten animals. His beam skimmed across one of the fast food counters, and caught the faintest shimmer of movement. It was subtle. A soda machine button slowly depressing, releasing a hiss of air though the machine was unplugged. He watched it happen, the button sinking on its own, before snapping back into place with a hollow clack. His chest tightened. He wrote it down, though the words looked absurd even as he jotted them. Soda machine activated on its own, unplugged. The act of writing made it real. Too real. The clock ticked toward 3 a.m. The hour he had come to dread, though he didn't know exactly why. That was when the mall always seemed to shift. The temperature dropped. The shadows thickened. He could swear the layout itself seemed unfamiliar, as if corridors had lengthened by a step or two. as if the mall itself had been waiting for this precise hour. Michael approached the department store entrance on the far side of the atrium. The gates were chained shut, but his flashlight beam fell on the faintest reflection inside. He leaned closer, pressing the beam against the bars. Something gleamed from within, rows of mannequins, pale plastic faces turned toward him. He knew they were always there, always stationed in their frozen ranks, but tonight, one was closer to the gate than he remembered, its head tilted slightly to the side. He froze, blinking hard, convincing himself it was a trick of perspective. But when he angled the flashlight, the shadow beneath the mannequin's chin shifted. Its plastic mouth was cracked open in the faintest suggestion of a grin. He staggered back, breath catching in his throat, nearly dropping the light. The gate was locked. The store sealed. The mannequins had not moved, could not move. And yet the impression lingered, the same way he had felt eyes on him in the corridor earlier. He forced himself away, pulse thudding in his ears. "Keep walking. Keep walking," he whispered under his breath, as though rhythm alone could stabilize him. But when he turned down the next hall, his whispering cadence faltered. Because he wasn't alone. The sound came first, footsteps. Not his. Not an echo, but distinct, staggered strides keeping pace behind him. He snapped the flashlight beam backward, the corridor blazing white. Empty. Then the sound ceased. His skin prickled as though needles were pressing just beneath the surface. He couldn't explain it, but he knew the mall had shifted again. It wasn't just the mannequins or the soda machine. It was as if something was trying to mimic life, piece by piece, in the hollow carcass of the building. It was stalking him through impressions. Footsteps without feet, voices without mouths, movements without bodies. Michael steadied himself, whispering, "You're fine. You're fine." He tried to take another step forward, but his legs hesitated. Because just ahead, the light revealed something that had not been there before. A wet trail. Thin, glistening lines that stretched across the tile, leading deeper into the dark. It looked like water at first, but the way it caught the light was too thick, too viscous. Michael's breath stilled. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly. He crouched, bringing the light closer to the tile. The trail was crimson. Blood. It stretched toward the corridor that led to the service stairwell. His radio crackled suddenly, erupting in a burst of static so loud he flinched. He fumbled for the receiver, pressing it close. "See? Anyone? Copy." The voice fractured, overlapping with its own delayed echo, like multiple versions of the same person speaking at different times. Then silence. No one was supposed to be on the other end. Not at this hour. Not on this frequency. Michael felt the pull in his chest, the irresistible, bone-deep compulsion to follow the trail, to step into that stairwell, to see what the mall was drawing him toward. But some primal part of him screamed in protest. The hairs on his neck rose. His gut twisted. Whatever weighted down there was not meant to be found. And yet the silence behind him was heavier than the dread ahead. He raised his flashlight, stepped toward the stairwell. The dripping grew louder. Michael's flashlight flickered against the edges of the stairwell, the pale beam trembling as he descended. Each step brought a hollow echo, rebounding against concrete walls that seemed to lean closer with every movement. The dripping grew louder, a slow, deliberate percussion layered with a faint dragging sound beneath the tiles. He paused halfway down, catching his breath. The air was colder here, damp, and smelled faintly of rust and mildew. He could see the stairwell's bottom only as a shadowy rectangle, a yawning mouth swallowing the light. His instincts screamed to turn back, but something sharper, some mental tether, pulled him downward, insisting he continue. As he reached the bottom, he noticed faint streaks along the floor, thin lines of crimson, smeared as if dragged by hands or feet. They glistened in the flashlight's beam, reflecting fragmented light onto the low ceiling. His chest tightened. Michael crouched, tracing one mark with his gloved fingertip. The substance clung, sticky and heavy, then fell back into the shape it had taken. No object, no body, just the trail. He rose, every nerve screaming, and took a cautious step forward. The stairwell emptied into a long, narrow service corridor. Pipes ran along the ceiling, dripping slowly. Electrical panels lined the walls, locked and unyielding. His flashlight danced across them, each reflection amplifying the shadows, making corners deepen unnaturally. The corridor seemed longer than it should be, stretching beyond the building's layout he memorized. A faint hum pulsed under the tile floor. At first he thought it was the building's machinery, then realized the hum was irregular, breathing-like, rising and falling in quiet, measured waves. It seemed to synchronize with his own heartbeat. He paused. Ahead, a door was ajar, only a sliver of black visible beyond the frame. Michael froze. He remembered checking every maintenance door on his patrol. This one had been closed. Locked. Now it stood open as if inviting him in. The hairs on his neck bristled. He raised the flashlight and stepped closer. The gap was dark, empty, but it felt alive. Something watched from within, something patient. A whisper of movement brushed the edge of his peripheral vision, vanishing before he could focus on it. Michael swallowed hard. "Who's there?" he whispered, voice cracking slightly. No answer. Only the low hum beneath the tiles. He squared his shoulders and edged forward, pressing the flashlight through the doorway. The beam revealed nothing at first, just a small windowless room filled with stacked boxes, janitorial supplies, and shadows that clung unnaturally to corners. Then he saw it, a smear along the wall, faint but unmistakably crimson, leading toward the far corner. His pulse surged. He followed the mark slowly, footsteps careful and deliberate, flashlight dancing across the shadowed floor. Every step seemed to echo longer than it should, overlapping with a phantom rhythm that mimicked his own. As he approached the corner, his beam caught a figure, or something like one. Pale, indistinct, pressed against the wall. Michael jerked back, heart hammering. The thing did not move like a human. Its outline wavered, shifting subtly, impossible to focus on. The shadows warped around it, blending and reforming as he blinked. He swallowed. Rational thought clawed at him. "It's just a trick of the light, Michael. Nothing more." But the trail of crimson led relentlessly onward, and the sensation of being observed pressed against his chest. He had followed anomalies all night. Footsteps, soda machines, mannequins, and each had led him here. Now, every instinct screamed that whatever waited was aware. A sudden shift of air brushed against his cheek, warm and deliberate, as though something had passed close behind him. He spun, flashlight cutting a wide arc empty. The room had not changed. Yet the sensation lingered, a slow, pressing weight in the back of his mind. Michael clenched the flashlight tighter. The trail continued, curling toward a corner where pipes intersected. He hesitated, breath catching in his throat. Something low hummed, vibrating through the floor, the walls, threading into his skull. The hum rose gradually, almost like a warning. He stepped around the corner. The trail ended abruptly at a service elevator, its metal doors scuffed, the call button blinking faintly. But there was no elevator car visible inside. The shaft yawned black, an empty tunnel descending into shadows. Michael's pulse raced. He realized he could not see the bottom. Something moved inside the darkness. A shape, or a suggestion of one, rose slowly, impossibly elongated, then froze as if aware he was watching. His breath caught. Every muscle tensed. The sense of being herded, the careful, patient nudging of his movement, solidified into certainty. The anomalies weren't random. They were guiding him. Toward this. He raised the radio again. Static. Unbroken. Anyone? Copy. Nothing. The isolation pressed in. There were no other humans on this frequency. The mall had cut him off. Completely. Michael swallowed. He was standing at the edge of the unknown. The dripping from earlier now sounded like deliberate percussion, guiding him, taunting him. His flashlight trembled in his hands, and he realized the mall itself was no longer a building. It was an organism. Watching. Waiting. Directing. He took a single step toward the elevator shaft. The shape stirred, vanishing as if it had never been. The dripping intensified. Something heavy shifted beneath the floorboards. The air thickened, pressing against his lungs. He felt a tug, a compulsion stronger than fear, stronger than reason, drawing him forward. Michael's mind screamed to stop, to retreat, but the trail demanded he move. Step by step, footstep by echoing footstep, He followed the invisible guide deeper into the bowels of the mall. Every corner bent unnaturally, every shadow seemed to anticipate him. The building was alive and he was its chosen observer. The dripping slowed, then stopped. Silence filled the corridor, heavy, oppressive. Michael's breath came fast, shallow. He raised the flashlight one last time and saw a door, metal, unmarked, slightly ajar, waiting for him. Beyond it he could not see. Beyond it, he felt the weight of every anomaly, every subtle manipulation from the night, converging into one undeniable presence. Michael hesitated, every rational thought abandoned. This was the point of no return. Every choice he had made, the footsteps he followed, the signs tilted, the mannequins frozen in silent vigil, had led here. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. The darkness swallowed him. Michael's foot hovered over the threshold of the metal door, the beam of his flashlight quivering like a heartbeat. Beyond, darkness stretched with an unnatural density, swallowing every hint of light. The air smelled of damp metal and something older, fouled and organic. The dripping that had followed him now paused, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed into his chest. He hesitated. Rational thought clawed at him. This is a storage room. Nothing could be here, nothing but dust and old equipment. But every instinct in his body screamed otherwise. The anomalies, the subtle manipulations of the mall, the dripping, the shadows, they had all led him here. He was no longer patrolling. He was being herded, guided, and whatever awaited him behind this door had been waiting all along. Michael stepped inside. The flashlight beam revealed a narrow room, walls lined with metal shelves holding cleaning supplies, old display materials, and boxes stacked haphazardly. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the air thrummed with expectation, like the building itself was holding its breath. He froze. The beam darted across the shadows. One of the boxes had shifted slightly. Not fallen, shifted as though nudged by unseen hands. His throat tightened. Step by step, he advanced, the beam trembling with each movement. As he reached the far end of the room, the shadows thickened. The far wall seemed to absorb the light entirely. Michael raised the flashlight higher, but the beam dissolved into the darkness, failing to illuminate more than a few inches ahead. A soft, wet hiss echoed from the corner, barely audible but unmistakably deliberate. He crouched, inspecting the floor. Crimson streaks returned, thin, deliberate, stretching toward a small service hatch he hadn't noticed before. The hatch was metal, unmarked, and sealed with a simple latch. The blood trailed up to it, then vanished as if pulled inside. A cold realization gripped him. Something, or someone, had moved below. Michael's heartbeat accelerated. He glanced around, half expecting movement, half hoping for none. Then he heard it, the whisper. Not through the walls, not through the intercom, but inside his own head. A dry, sibilant voice, incomprehensible yet patient, guiding him. He swallowed, forcing reason back. I am imagining this. There is no one here. Yet the blood, the subtle movement of objects, the manipulated environment, they insisted otherwise. Step by step, he moved toward the service hatch. His fingers brushed the latch. Cold metal, slick with condensation. The whispering intensified, soft syllables, fragments like language half-formed. The air thickened, pressing against his lungs. He exhaled sharply and the sound echoed back, distorted. Michael opened the hatch. Darkness yawned below, deeper than he could see. A chill climbed his spine. The smell of damp earth, rust, and something faintly acrid rose from the void. He lowered himself slowly, each movement deliberate, flashlight beams skimming walls slick with moisture. He reached the bottom. The floor was cold concrete. The blood trail ended abruptly. And then he saw them, shapes just at the edge of perception, pressed against the walls. Pale, humanoid, but wrong. Limbs too long, heads tilting at impossible angles. They did not move when he approached, they only observed. A low groan reverberated through the space, not from a throat but from the air itself. Michael's teeth clenched. The creatures, or the impressions of them, shifted, blending into shadows and corners, always at the edge of sight. He swung the flashlight wildly, but every beam found only vague suggestion. Step by step, he followed the trail of crimson. The air grew warmer, thick, almost viscous. His chest felt pressed by invisible hands. Every anomaly from the night, the soda machine, the footprints, the tilted signs, the open doors, the hurting, converged here. The mall had led him to its heart. Then movement. Subtle, deliberate. One of the figures extended a hand, not toward him, but along the wall, tracing the path of his flashlight beam. The motion was unnerving, fluid but unnatural, as if gravity itself had been rewritten in its vicinity. Michael stumbled back, heart pounding. He realized the hallway behind him had shifted. The walls no longer matched the building's layout. Corridors that should have ended extended, bending in impossible angles. He was no longer in a simple service tunnel. He was in a labyrinth designed to disorient, to trap. A whisper rose, louder now, filling the space around him. Fragments of language, distorted, urgent, repeated, "Follow, follow, follow." Michael's mind raced. Retreat was impossible. Every turn led deeper into darkness. Every step reinforced the pull he had felt since the stairwell. He had been led here, guided toward some focal point, some unseen convergence. A sudden shift of shadow made him spin. One figure had moved closer, too fast, almost imperceptibly, yet undeniable. It pressed against a wall, head tilted unnaturally, observing. Michael raised the flashlight, the beam slicing through darkness, but the creature, or its suggestion, dissolved before he could focus. He stumbled back toward the hatch. The exit was no longer where it should have been. Every angle had changed subtly. The labyrinth had rearranged itself while he wasn't looking. Panic rose. He fumbled with the hatch ladder, but his hands met only cold, slick metal, uncooperative. The whispers intensified, layered now with footsteps that were not his own, walking in measured cadence around him. He turned, flashlight scanning rapidly. Shadows twisted and elongated, moving with him, always staying just out of reach. Michael realized, in bone-deep clarity, that he was no longer navigating the mall. He was navigating their space, drawn forward by intention. Every anomaly of the night had been a signal, a manipulator. He had been conditioned to follow. And the deeper he went, the stronger the pull became. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to move forward. The trail of crimson led him to a low archway. Beyond, the air seemed heavier, almost liquid, and the shadows crowded closer. Shapes pressed against the walls, pale and wrong eyes, or eye-like voids, tracking every flicker of his light. Michael's hand shook. He whispered to himself, "This is just a building. Nothing alive can be here." But the building had stopped being just a building. It had become a predator, and he was at the center of its hunting ground. The whispering reached a fevered pitch. He had no choice. Step by step, he moved deeper into the shadowed archway, guided by compulsion, driven by curiosity and terror intertwined. Every anomaly, every subtle manipulation of the mall had brought him to this precise point. And whatever waited ahead knew he was coming. Michael took one final breath. Beyond the archway, he knew there would be no turning back. The mall had claimed the night, and now it would claim him. Michael's flashlight flickered as he stepped deeper into the darkness beyond the archway. The underground corridor seemed to fold around him, walls bending at impossible angles. The whispers from earlier had coalesced into a low, vibrating drone, resonating through the concrete, threading into his bones. Every step he took echoed, then echoed again, slightly delayed as if the building itself was mocking him. He reached a chamber-like space, walls slick with moisture. Shadows clung to every corner, pooling into dark shapes that seemed to move just out of focus. The trail of crimson ended abruptly in the center of the floor, a dark stain radiating outward, as if whatever had been dragged here had vanished entirely. Michael's breath came shallow, rapid. The air was thick, heavy, and impossible to fill. A sudden shift of air brushed past his ear, warm, deliberate. He spun, flashlight sweeping, but the space remained empty. And yet he could feel it, presence, patient, observing, waiting. Something about the way the shadows leaned, the way the light seemed swallowed, told him he wasn't alone. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with anticipation. Michael forced himself to breathe, to focus. He realized the mall had guided him here for a reason, not just to terrify but to reveal. Every anomaly, the soda machine, the open doors, the tilted signs, the herding of shadows, was part of a pattern he had been drawn into without realizing it. A faint glow appeared at the far end of the chamber. At first he thought it was a reflection, a trick of his light on damp concrete. But the glow coalesced into shape, a figure humanoid in outline yet impossible. Its limbs stretched and bent at unnatural angles, head tilting in ways that defied anatomy. Its eyes, or empty voids where eyes might have been, seemed to track him. Michael stumbled back, heart hammering. Rational thought faltered. He had seen impossible things tonight. Objects moving of their own accord, footsteps without bodies, shadows that mimicked him. Now, whatever this was, it existed fully in the physical space around him, and yet it was not entirely physical. He took a careful step forward. The figure shifted slightly, tilting its head, mimicking his movement in perfect, silent imitation. Michael realized with a creeping dread that the mall had taught it to anticipate him. Every choice, every instinct, every step he had taken was mirrored, recorded, understood. A soft drip fell from the ceiling, landing on the concrete beside him. The sound was ordinary yet magnified by tension, echoing as if mocking him. He raised his flashlight again. The figure seemed closer, yet the distance between them had not changed. Shadows stretched and folded unnaturally, pressing against him. Michael swallowed, gripping the flashlight tightly. Every fiber of his being screamed to run, to escape, but the path back had vanished. Corridors twisted, walls had shifted. He was not simply in the basement. He was in a maze the mall had created for him, a labyrinth of shadows and expectation. He noticed something else. Faint markings on the floor, scrawled in dust or residue, almost symbols, almost letters, but too irregular to read. They formed a pattern leading deeper into the chamber. Against instinct, against fear, Michael felt the pull. He had to follow. Each step amplified the dread, yet also revealed the mall's secret. Its anomalies were deliberate, a system of communication. The building, alive in its own way, had been guiding him to this chamber to witness, to learn, to understand. And now he understood. Every shift of shadows, every unexpected sound, every impossible reflection had been preparation for this moment. The figure moved again, closer, and Michael noticed something in the glow. Shapes reflected along the walls, other presences, pale and indistinct, hovering at the edges of vision. They did not advance, but they did not retreat either. They were waiting, patient, like predators who knew their prey could not escape. A sudden crash echoed behind him. Something heavy struck the metal shelving he had passed earlier. Michael whipped around. Empty. But a cold realization hit him. The mall was rearranging itself, controlling the space, controlling his perception. It had been testing him all along. He exhaled, trying to steady himself. The figure, impossible, pale, elongating, remained in the center, motionless. The whispers returned, now louder, layered, overlapping, indistinct words forming an urgent cadence. Follow, witness, understand. Michael's mind raced. He had no idea what these presences wanted, or if they wanted anything at all. But one thing was undeniable. He had been changed. The mall, the anomalies, the shadows, they had imprinted something deep within him, a memory of being observed, herded, and tested. He backed toward the chamber's exit, only to realize the way back had shifted. The labyrinth of the mall had collapsed, corridors stretching and twisting impossibly. The exit no longer aligned with the path he had taken. Panic rose. Every instinct screamed escape, but escape was impossible. Then, as suddenly as it began, the figures and shadows receded, the chamber growing still. The dripping slowed. The hum diminished. Michael found himself alone, standing in a hallway he didn't recognize, the floor clear, the walls ordinary. No blood, no symbols, no figure, just silence and stale air. He realized he had survived, or at least returned, but the mall had left its mark. Every sense remained sharpened, every shadow suspicious, every sound a potential signal. The night's events had altered his perception irreversibly. Michael climbed the stairwell back to the surface, emerging into the morning light. The mall appeared normal again. Polished floors, bright windows, and the faint murmur of staff and early customers. The horrors of the night seemed impossible, ephemeral, but he knew better. They had been real. He walked past the food court, past the mannequins, past the directory signs now perfectly aligned. Everything was ordinary, or as ordinary as it could be after what he had seen. The mall had returned to daytime functionality, but he knew it waited still, patient, ready for the next visitor, the next night, the next anomaly. Michael left the mall, the early sunlight cutting across his path, but his shadow carried the weight of the night. Every reflective surface, every quiet corridor, reminded him of the presences that had guided him, of the subtle patterns no one else could see. The mall had not released him, it had only allowed him a temporary reprieve. And somewhere in the depth of his memory the trail waited, patient, deliberate, eternal. As he walked away, the question lingered, not just for Michael but for anyone who dared to step into these halls. How far would you go if the shadows themselves guided your steps? If you want to uncover more true horror stories that will haunt your nights, subscribe to Mind's Abyss. New terrifying stories are uploaded every single day. Don't just listen, step carefully into the abyss before the next shadow finds you.